This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I want to give a special thank you to Yanko Svetkov, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so now let's get to our show. Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, and welcome to episode 577 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the short story collection The Best of Roger Zelazny, part of the SF Masterworks series of science fiction classics. And this will include spoilers for everything in the book, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined today by my good friend Tom Gerencer, making his 30th appearance on the show. His short fiction appears in magazines such as Galaxy's Edge, and in books such as New Voices in Science Fiction. He's the author of the business book Think Like Google, and the short story collection Intergalactic Refrigerator Repairmen Seldom Carry Cash, and his popular science book How It's Made, written for the Discovery Channel, is out now. So, Tom, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dave. 30. Wow. I'm honored.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, just tell us a bit about your history reading Roger Zelazny.
So my history with Roger Zelazny is tied directly to my history with reading any science fiction at all and fantasy. I was, born in 1969, so I grew up encountering science fiction through used bookstores, which I would kind of walk around these old, dusty, musty-smelling used bookstores, and I would look for the science fiction books. And anything that had, back then, most of the science fiction art was really had this psychedelic bent to it, because it was, most of the stuff I was looking at, if it's a used book in the 80s, it was probably written in the 60s or 70s. So it had all this psychedelic, hippie art on the cover that usually had aliens or spaceships or stuff. And I quickly started to find my favorite authors. I stumbled across Robert Sheckley and was blown away by him. And around the same time, the same thing happened to me with Roger Zelazny. I read a couple of his books and was just absolutely floored by him. I hadn't a lot of the stuff I read back then was real mechanical, sort of. It was like, oh, here's some aliens, and here's a spaceship, here's another planet, and here's a story. And a lot of the science fiction written in the 60s and 70s was either that kind of thing, or it was very psychedelic, very delving into the mysteries of the mind. And by contrast, Roger Zelazny and Robert Sheckley was just hilariously funny, and Roger Zelazny was just really well plotted and had a deep emotional bang to him that I didn't find in a lot of stuff. And so I was hooked by him very early on. I found out that he had a great sense of humor. He didn't always use it, but he used it quite frequently. And I was very into comedy and humor. So I really liked him for that. But I also there was just something about him that I just absolutely loved. And I will share that later. And I think it took me a long time reading this anthology, thinking about why do I like this guy so much? And I figured it out. And not only did I figure it out, but it comes I think as a good insight for any writer or reader of science fiction that will probably help your craft a lot. It may be something that people already know, but I think it hit me as somebody who's been alive for 55 years, and it had never struck me before why I like him so much. But I'll save that for a little bit later.
Yeah, we'll have a little suspense here to find out what that is.
Right.
When you say that you read those first couple Zelazny books, do you remember what those were, the first couple that you encountered?
I don't. I remember the first one that blew me away was Doorways in the Sand. I had never encountered anything like that before or since. I was just absolutely... I won't say or since, because it's after I started reading Rex Stout, which is not science fiction. He wrote detective novels starting in the 1920s. he is very. I became convinced that Zelazny had read a lot of Rex Stout and was writing sort of a science fiction answer to the Nero Wolfe novels.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know Zelazny read a lot of hard-boiled detective fiction kind of stuff. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a collection of all of Zelazny's short stories from Nesfa Press, the New England Science Fiction Association. They're all these beautiful hardcovers with Michael Whalen covers and everything, and there's lots of like testimonials and from people who knew Zelazny. And there's one from Jane Lindskold, who was his partner toward the end of his life. And she mentions that specifically, like among the things that he loved the most were, like the hard-boiled noir kind of novels. So, and you can definitely see that influence in just basically his basic voice that he uses in most of his stories and just in a lot of his subject matter. You have a lot of, femme fatales and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But let me tell you how I got into Zelazny. It's kind of interesting, that you said you were into Robert Sheckley. I mean, my favorite author when I was a kid, like elementary school, was Robert Asprin, who wrote the Myth series of funny fantasy novels. And so I'd read all of those like a dozen times, and I went looking to find more funny fantasy. And back then, there's no internet, so you're just kind of looking at covers and trying to judge based on the cover. And so I came across the cover for Roger Zelazny's Guns of Avalon, which is the second book in the Amber series. And the cover I thought was so goofy. I was like, oh, this is probably a funny book, And I mean, it's not really. I mean, Zelazny is, it's not a comedy, but he's incredibly funny and witty. But he does so much more. I mean, he's just, great action and poetic language and, incredible, plot twists and imagination and all this stuff. So it ended up being even better than I was expecting. And then the Amber books became my favorite series, kind of, in middle school, high school, around there. And I've read all of them at least 5 times. And the ones I really like, I've read literally dozens of times. And then so the Amber was kind of my first love. And then I've also read a bunch of his other standalone novels, and I've read all of his short stories, like I said, in that, in that 5 or maybe 6 volume set that I have. And so I had read a lot of his short stories as a kid. He had collections like, there was one called The Doors of His Face, The Lamps of His Mouth. There was one called The Last Defender of Camelot, and there's one called Frost and Fire, which I definitely read. So I'd read a good chunk of his stories then. And then when the Nesfa Press books came out, then that was about 15 years ago. I read them then. And then I just read this new book, The Best of Roger Zelazny. So most of the stories in here, I read them when I was a kid. I read them 15 years ago, and I read them just this week. So it's kind of an interesting, I can remember how I felt about the different stories at different ages and stuff.
It's different. It's interesting that you say that you read the Amber books, some of them dozens of times. That's amazing. Do you find his other stuff that rereadable? And do you think that was something because you were younger, or do you also find, are there other writers where you like their stuff so much that you just read it over and over and over again?
I mean, I just like rereading stuff. Like I said, so the Myth books I read all of those at least a dozen times. I mean, as I've gotten older, I just don't have time. I mean, like the Book of the New Sun, I've read 5 times. Song of Ice and Fire, I read the first 5 times at least. So yeah, I just like revisiting my favorite worlds and stuff. But definitely Zelazny is incredibly rereadable, and the fact that he writes in a very fast-paced, witty, funny, kind of action-packed way, definitely contributes to that. But he's sort of been hit or miss for me. I mean, like there's, some of the Amber books, like I said, I love, and some of them I just kind of, force myself to read them because they're part of the set and I want the complete experience. And some of them, like Jack of Shadows, I tried a couple times to read and can never really get into it. So, I mean, he's my favorite author, and, at his best, I just absolutely adore what he's doing. But for me, he's very inconsistent. Some of the stuff leaves me kind of cold, as we'll see when we discuss the stories in this book. But I mean, I would much rather, this was something that I noticed workshopping stories, at creative writing workshops and stuff, I would much rather have a story that kind of swings for the fences and either, is either a home run or just kind of falls flat than something that's, consistently, high quality, but doesn't really move you or blow you away or anything.
I agree. I think he's inconsistent. Sheckley was inconsistent as well. He had some novels that weren't funny that were fantastic, and he had some novels that weren't funny that were not good either. And Zelazny, yeah, I just put them in such a box together because even though, I mean, they were friends, and there was a place in a Robert Sheckley story collection where one of the introductions that he wrote to his own stories, he talked about how he and Roger Zelazny would write together sometimes, and they would. I could have him confused with another writer, but I think
they collaborated on a trilogy of
comedy
books,
the Bring Me the Head of Prince Charming, but I think it was If at Faust You Don't Succeed, Bring Me the Head of Prince Charming was the first one. Faust You Don't Succeed, and then what was the third one? I don't remember, but it was
a farce
similar,
to be reckoned with. I think
that's it. Yeah, A Farce to Be Reckoned With.
I've never read any of them, but I just kind of know the titles.
I read them and I remember being a little bit nonplussed with them, but I just, anything by either of them, I'm the same way you are. I'm like, these guys I think of as my friends. So even though, I was sort of friends with Robert Sheckley. In a way, we just had like a long email correspondence and he was very kind to me, and Zelazny, sadly, he died very young, but they had written, Robert Sheckley had written this introduction to this story. And when they were writing those, I guess they had this like strategy. He was trying to tell you like, here's how, it was actually an essay that Sheckley wrote called How Pro Writers Write or Try to. And in there, he talks about how he, and I believe it was Roger Zelazny, would like share a room where they would both write, and they shared a typewriter. And one of them would physically handcuff the other to the chair or to the table while they were like typing. And then he would leave and go get lunch or whatever, or leave and go do stuff and come back and unlock the one who was handcuffed. And then, he would lock the other guy in and then write. And he's like, yeah, that didn't really work. But I just put them, because of that and because of how their stuff is from the same era and because of how it hits me emotionally, both of them, I just put them in kind of a box together where I think the stuff that they do well, I really, really love them for. And the stuff that they don't do well, I go, you really tried with this one, or maybe you needed the money, or I don't know what, but I don't really care. I'll read it. But I agree about Jack of Shadows. Like I read that one because that was one of the ones where I was walking through bookstores going, if I see any Zelazny or any Sheckley, I'm going to buy it. And I bought Jack of Shadows and didn't love it except for, number one, it's a cool concept. The guy his magical power is if there's a shadow, he can become absolutely invisible in it. And number two, the fun, and this is something that I want to mention because it fits in with some of the stories in this volume. The fun way that he'll have like this mentor / potential enemy who he butts up against in a certain situation, who gives him some advice about the problems he's going through. And in Jack of Shadows, there's this wonderful character called Morningstar, who's a demon who's been frozen in ice or something like that. Part of him is locked in ice, but he's frozen anyway. He can't move until sunlight hits him. But because of the way this world is constructed, half of the world is always in sunlight and half of the world is always in night. And this demon, Morningstar, is frozen where he can just start to see the first rays of dawn. But because the planet isn't spinning, he has to remain frozen. But if he ever gets unlocked, he's going to destroy the whole world. But Jack of Shadows has this relationship with him where they can talk and they can chat back and forth. And that part of the book, to me, there was only like 3 chapters with Morningstar in them. But I forgive the whole book because of those 3 chapters. I mean, what a cool character and what a cool friendship / he knows the guy can be his enemy. But still they have this easy kind of camaraderie thing going on.
Well, and that's interesting because, Morning Star is sort of a classical name for the devil. And in Dante's Inferno, the devil is at the lowest level of hell, is kind of imprisoned in ice, up to his waist. And so Zelazny was just incredibly well-read and well-educated in religion and mythology. And so, that kind of stuff. He just used that stuff all over the place in his fantasy and science fiction to incredible effect.
Yeah, that's one of the fun things about reading him is he's so well-read in so much classical literature and every kind of literature and science and philosophy that his characters are never just kind of observing things for what they are. They are always observing things based on a vast repertoire of art and science and music and any other kind of, and religion, and able to say, well, nobody's ever just driving down a road in a Zelazny story. They're driving down a road that has characteristics that are reminiscent of, and then he pulls in all these fascinating things that just kind of blow you away as you're sitting there. You're like, it's so cool to experience this and ride around in this guy's mind.
Mm-hmm. In this Nesva collection, I was reading one of the essays the other night, and it said that Zelazny would read 7 to 9 books a week.
Wow.
And I have to believe there was some amount of skimming going on, but I think he would sort of go through these, he was just constantly on the hunt for interesting books and would kind of read through them really fast, looking for the most interesting things and kind of commit those to memory. So he had just this incredible catalog of fascinating insights and fascinating factoids that he could, deploy in his art.
It comes through, and I'm not. Yeah, it makes sense that he would be skimming some of it, but then the stuff that really hit him, like he would hang on to those things. So, he would really things that obviously he's probably skimming through a lot of it, and then some of it he's going more slowly as he figures out, like, well, this one's really worth it, worth the time.
I guess I'll also just mention, just to give you an idea of what a Zelazny fan is, when I proposed to my girlfriend, now my wife, I proposed to her on the road leading up to the ski basin in Santa Fe because it's one of the locations featured in the Amber series. So
that's awesome.
That's what an amber nut I am.
I knew you really loved Amber, but I didn't realize you were such a fan of Zelazny as a whole. So that's really cool. I think he's one of my favorite writers, and he's absolutely fantastic.
Well, yeah, and also, since I read the Nesva Press book 15 years ago, I've learned a lot more about Zelazny than I knew before. And, for this podcast, I interviewed F. Brett Cox, and he wrote sort of a book-length study of Zelazny's work, an academic study. And I interviewed Warren Lapine, he's now like the main publisher of Zelazny's work. And he put out this like 1,000-page collection of Zelazny's letters. So, and I've been to Santa Fe. I drove by his old house. I've hung out with people who were friends of his and stuff. So it was interesting bringing that perspective of knowing a lot more about him as a person, to these stories now, because he was a really private person. And so, he never wrote any memoirs or never really talked about his political views or his family life or anything. So, you kind of have to dig a little bit, or at least certainly, in the 90s or 2000s, you certainly, it was not really easy to find out a lot about Zelazny's, inner life or anything.
Yeah, it must be cool to know that much about him. I listened to your 2 podcasts, and they were really cool. And I kind of want to read the letters, but I don't know if I'd get the time to read 1,000 pages of his letters. But I think it must be really cool. He was through listening to your podcast. I didn't know that Zelazny was such an interesting guy outside of writing. Like, he was apparently like really skilled at judo. And that's why when you read his action sequences, you're like, this just seems to all make sense. I don't know why. But then you find that out about him and you're like, okay, well, that's why, because he really lived this stuff. He isn't just making this up. He really knows how this would work.
Yeah. He was apparently captain of the fencing team in college, and he was a black belt in Aikido. And actually taught Aikido. So, yeah, he really knew a lot about fighting.
Cool.
All right, but cool. So let's get into this book. So Tom, you had requested that we sort of start off with the stories we don't like as much and kind of move our way through to the stories that we love. So we're going to start off. And Tom and I, we kind of ranked the stories and sent each other our rankings this morning. And so about half the stories we're pretty much in agreement on, but we have some pretty major divergences in our opinions about half the stories, which is good. It'll make this, I think, a more interesting conversation. But so we both ranked the story, I don't know, Corrida as the weakest. So this is a story I must have read this before, but it didn't stick in my memory at all. It's only like 2 or 3 pages long. And it's basically, this guy gets abducted by aliens and then is in sort of a bullfight situation where he's the bull. And, to me, it just read more like a writing exercise, like something maybe Zelazny tossed off in an hour.
Exactly.
There's nothing particularly wrong with it, but there's nothing that particularly memorable about it to me either.
Yeah, it reminded me of something we would have read from any one of us at Clarion where the instructor would have said, "This is, it's a really cool idea, but it's not really a story." And I would have sat there and thought, well, why isn't it a story? It's a story. It's got words. It's on paper. It takes up 3,000 words. I don't get it. But I sort of do get it more now. I mean, I think, it doesn't have any kind of emotional impact. There's no reason why this person in particular, more than any other, would be interesting in that place, or he doesn't really try to do anything. He just kind of is in a box, and that's it. He's in this interesting box, but it's still just a box.
Yeah, so I don't really get why this was included in this book. I mean, I don't know if if maybe there was some limit to which stories they could pick, in terms of involving rights or something, or if they just had they were left over with a very short amount of space, and this was one of the few things that would fit in that space or something. I don't know, but I would not have put. I mean, there's a lot of stories I'm sure that I would have put in place of this one.
Well, yeah, Lisa Tuttle, who wrote the introduction, who was the editor, by the way, who chose these stories?
I'm actually not sure. So this is part of the SF Masterworks line. And part of the reason I wanted to highlight this is because I love the SF Masterworks series. I found it generally the most consistent source for finding the best classic science fiction. I mean, there's like 178 volumes in the series or something like that.
Wow.
I mean, so I certainly haven't read all of them, but I really like the ones I've read. I really like their taste, but I don't see if it says what particular person picked these stories, so I'm not sure.
I didn't see it on the cover, but I found it somewhere online, and then I didn't write it down. But Lisa Tuttle says, I don't know.
Yeah, let's just explain. Lisa Tuttle wrote an introduction for the book, but she didn't pick the stories.
Right. So she said, I don't know that I would have chosen, all the stories that are here. And she gives as an example, Damnation Alley. But then, and I was thinking some of the stories I'd read and I'd think, why did they choose this one? And then I compared my list to yours. And I thought, well, I think it's a real challenge to pick any best of with any prolific writer. There are going to be, 40% of the people out there who really love one story and 40% of the people out there who really love another. And then 20% who are like, I absolutely hate both of those. So it must be any kind of best of is going to be subjective to some degree. You're going to have to to choose the ones you think are the best, and it's going to miss
for sure. And I think that's a testament to Zelazny that we can have so much divergence of the two of us can have so much divergence of opinion, because I feel like with most authors we would be pretty much in sync for most of it, and this we're a little bit all over the place. So
right, it's not like if I don't like a story that you like, it's not so much that he did a bad job writing it or that's a bad story. It's just that it's not to my particular taste. So you could sit there and argue, well, yes, but it's a good story, and I'd have to say, well, you're right. But it's not. You're right. A weaker writer, you'd say, well, these are the good stories this person wrote, and these are the ones that aren't any good.
Yeah, so let's move on to Loki 7281, that we both agreed was rather weak. So this is one where it's like Zelazny. I mean, it doesn't say Zelazny, but it's Zelazny gets a new word processor, which through some fluke at the factory or something has developed sentience and has been rewriting his stories, without him knowing. And as the story develops, once he becomes suspicious of it, it starts plotting to murder him. And there's actually a a video. The only video I've ever been able to find of Zelazny. There's this video on YouTube of him, and he reads this story and a section from one of the Amber books.
I watched
and the crowd.
It.
Oh yeah, and the crowd loves it. I mean, they're laughing at the whole time. So I mean, I think he wrote this as something he could read at conventions and get a laugh. But it's pretty forgettable overall to me.
Well, I will say that having lived through that time period, this was an absolutely brilliant story that does not stand the test of time. So if you and I were discussing this story in 1987, I think we would both say, like, this is awesome. It's brilliant, because he was writing it when word processors were new. That was a new thing. Stephen King wrote a story at that time called Word Processor of the Gods, where this writer, novelist who's supposed to be Stephen King, starts writing things in his story and then deleting them, and starts noticing that whatever he deletes vanishes from existence. So he starts deleting parts of his family that he doesn't like. And it reminded me a lot. This story reminded me a lot of that. It was just basically a smart writer who's successful at the time, who's faced with this new thing, like this word processor. What do we think of this? We've always just used typewriters in the past. Now we have this computer that stores all our stuff, and we don't have to like go through with whiteout and retype pages, and it's great, but is there some kind of cost to it? And I think Zelazny was reacting to that. And I think the reason I watched that video too on YouTube, and it's cool. If you haven't seen it and you're a Zelazny fan, it's cool to see him read one of his own stories. But I was just watching the crowd laughing their heads off, and I was thinking, it's not that funny. But I was thinking, but in 1986, it was that funny. Like, this was absolutely that funny back then. If he was writing a story right now about AI and wrote it with a similar level of humor, we might all laugh our heads off. And then in 20 years, people might think, 40 years, holy cow. People might think, no, this isn't that funny. I don't understand why it's that great. But I think maybe that's what it is. I think it's a story that was brilliant, but it was pulled out of its time, and now it doesn't work here.
Yeah. So those two, I think, are, for me, clearly the ones I would have picked something else to replace. And then the third story that we both were not that big fans of is one of Zelazny's most famous, probably like one of his two most famous, most acclaimed stories. So I think we're kind of in the minority on this one, but this is The Doors of His Face, The Lamps of His Mouth. And so this one, there's it's set on Venus, and in this story, Venus, is an ocean planet with big sea monsters swimming in it. This is the way that people imagined that Venus was before science proved otherwise. And so the main character had once tried to catch the sea monster and failed and humiliated himself. And now he has a second chance when this old flame comes back into the picture. And she's sort of this wealthy heiress or something, sort of. I guess one thing that's interesting about the story is that she's sort of like a social media influencer who's planning to catch this sea monster to sell her line of cosmetics products. So that was something I did like about the story. And so they have this giant sort of like floating oil platform kind of thing with a big sort of fish hook on it that they're going to use to try to catch the sea monster. So Tom, why do you think that you weren't so hot on this story that is so acclaimed, generally speaking?
Well, it's just sort of like you said, it's sort of Moby Dick on Venus, and not really Moby Dick because he takes all the kind of emotional punch out of Moby Dick. I thought it was, I do think it does have that thing that makes Zelazny rereadable. So would I never want to read it again? No, I would read it again. If I was looking around for something to read and that one popped up, I wouldn't say, nah, I don't want to read that. It has that thing that makes you want to reread his stuff. But in the end, it's just sort of like, and I do agree, I thought that was kind of prescient how he picks this sort of Paris Hilton or Kim Kardashian figure to be the sort of antagonist. But, or I guess the creature is the antagonist. So sort of another character in the story. But I don't know. I just sort of thought you get to the end of it and you're like, okay, well, I read that. It was Zelazny. It was a story about fishing in the future on a different planet. I could kind of see it working in the 60s when you're thinking about other planets, and wouldn't that be cool? But it just didn't seem to have much to it beyond that. So
I guess one thing I like about the story is that how he came up with the idea is that he used to just flip through the yellow pages at random and try to imagine, like, whatever his finger settled on, what it would be like in the future. And so he just came across an ad for like a bait and tackle shop, and that's what inspired the story. So I've always liked that. When people ask writers, where do you get your ideas? That's a very specific, concrete thing. You can tell. I'm like, oh, that's how Roger Zelazny got the idea for this story.
That's cool.
But I find it just a little dull to read. I mean, like, Zelazny is just this incredible prose stylist, but he has a tendency sometimes to go a little overboard, like no pun intended. And this is one where I just think the story's overwritten, sort of just too dense with figurative language and allusions and stuff, to the point where it just makes it a little bit of a chore to read, which is true of a couple of the other stories in this book for me as well. But then the other thing is that Zelazny has this kind of like archetypal hero that he uses in almost every book and story he ever wrote. And they, there are different flavors of them, but they tend to always be sort of these kind of arrogant men who are always sort of wisecracking and arguing with people. And when it works, like in the Amber books, it's this sort of arrogant jerk with a heart of gold. And when it doesn't work for me, it's just an arrogant jerk who I don't like, and I don't care what happens to him. And in this story, it's just, for me, too much of just an arrogant jerk who I don't like and don't want to spend time with and don't care what happens to him. There's no like heart of gold that comes through to me with this particular character.
That's interesting. I get nervous when I hear you say that I might just be an arrogant jerk, because I when I first fell in love with Zelazny, it was through Doorways in the Sand, like I said earlier, and I loved it so much I wanted everybody to read it, and I showed it to a friend of mine. I was like, "You got to read this book. It's like the best book ever." And he read it, and he goes, "I go, what'd you think of that book?" And he goes, "The main character is just a jerk. He's just like totally arrogant." And I was like, "Oh, I like really liked him." And he's like, "No, he just like thinks he's great, and he just like makes fun of everybody." And I was like, "Uh-oh, is there a problem that I think that's cool?" I think that character is awesome. He's like one of my favorite characters, but so I don't know what that says about me, but I guess I that part of it didn't bother me as much. I felt like in this story, I felt like that kind of arrogant jerk had a deeper something else going on that he wasn't showing you. It was kind of subtext that he had problems, that he thought he was great, but he had problems that everybody around him knew he had, and he just had a problem. That's why he was, did they paint? I can't remember. Did Zelazny paint him as like he had a drinking problem? And I feel like he did, but I can't remember exactly.
I don't remember if he mentions him having a drinking problem or not. I mean, he's certainly, I think, insecure. I mean, that's the whole point, is that he failed to catch this monster before, and part of the reason he's so abrasive is because of he's masking his insecurity. So it's not like there's no levels to the character. I just don't find him in like charm. Like Zelazny's capable of writing these characters with this incredible level of charm. Right. And I just didn't find this character charming enough to make me want to spend time with him.
Okay.
But I mean, that's a very subjective thing. I mean, again, this is, probably one of Zelazny's two most famous short stories. So, who cares what I think? But that's sort of how I react to it. And even as a kid, I never, like I said, I've read the story at least 3 times now, and it just always kind of leaves me cold. So I don't know. This particular story is just, not my favorite.
Why do people like it so much? Because I don't know. I like it. I mean, I enjoyed it. I remember the first time I read it, I thought, it was kind of cool, but I don't know that that I love it or anything like that. And now reading it again, sort of the same thing. I'm like, well, it's Zelazny. It's good. It's got a base level of good to it, but I guess I had to put it somewhere in comparison to the other stories, which I really like. So I wonder, what do people say who are like, no, this story is like one of his best?
I mean, I think for people who read it when it was new and it was like one of the first tastes they had of Zelazny, they were just blown away.
Yeah,
Whereas
I can see that.
if you've read a lot of his stuff and then you read this one, it doesn't have that same kind of impact, I don't think. But just the command of poetic language and the levels of illusion and, vast erudition on display, especially as applied to this sort of like pulp science fiction story, I just think was something people at the time had just never seen before. And they were just like, who is this guy? Where did he come from? How is this even possible to write a science fiction story like this?
Cool.
So I think there's some level of just, acclaim inertia at play, it seems to me.
Very cool.
But it would be interesting for me to see someone who, read a lot of Zelazny and then read this one, if they just loved it. But it seems to me that people who really love it are people who encountered it early on. At least that's my impression.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so those were the three that we agreed were sort of weak. Then there's two that Tom and I both agreed were like, fine, not amazing, but pretty good. And so these are The Great Slow Kings and Permafrost. And so The Great Slow Kings, there are these two reptilian aliens, and they are just incredibly slow. Like just the pace at which they experience the world is just incredibly slow, so that they'll have like a conversation and years or centuries are going by as they're, thinking about how they're going to respond. And it's more of like a Douglas Adams, Robert Sheckley kind of science fiction humor story. I think it's really, really funny. They have this robot servant that they send out to get humans to be their subjects because they have they're also very arrogant and very suspicious of each other, and each, sort of maneuvering to be in charge, even though they don't really rule over anything. And and then they get the humans, and the humans just fill up the whole planet and don't even notice that they're there because because they're in this like underground base and stuff. So to me, there's just like nothing more than a funny story, but it's a solid funny story. So Tom, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I wouldn't agree that I think these two stories are just okay, just fine, but not. I think when you're comparing them to the other stories that are just, in my mind, so amazing, you got to put them somewhere. And I think these stories would stack up to a lot of published science fiction I've read and enjoyed and thought was good science fiction. It's just that you're comparing it to other Zelazny. So I think these are both excellent stories. Like The Great Slow Kings is very funny and very like, I was just kind of wondering like, well, where's the conflict? And I ultimately think the conflict is just with Sloth. That's the antagonist, but it's not Sloth in their case, but it amounts to the same thing. Where they're like, oh, well, maybe we should like take over this other planet. And they're like, oh, and you're like, oh, here it comes. And then they're like, the computer that they built is like, well, they're like, do we still have any spaceships? And he's like, yeah, well, we built like 458 spaceships, but only 2 of them still work because the other ones are all in disrepair now because you never used them. And they're like, okay, well, should we use one? And they start talking. They have this big argument. And then the computer's like, sorry, just to let you know, there's only one left now. Because the half-life of the nuclear fuel has like expended. So now that you think how long their conversation takes, it's taking like long enough for the nuclear fuel to like wear out in the spaceship. So yeah, and then you realize like they're never going to be a threat to anything or anybody because they can't get off their butts to do anything. So it is very funny, and seeing the whole thing, me telling it is not half as funny as seeing it unfold. So I really like the story. I just had to put it somewhere, versus the other ones. Yeah,
and it's a good story to read out loud. If you want to just read a funny story out loud to somebody, I think it works really well for that. It's like hard to say that it's like super ambitious or anything, or like makes any like big points about the human condition or anything like that. But it's just like a funny science fiction story, and it's very good at being a funny science fiction story.
Right.
And so then Permafrost. So this is a story about there's this planet. It's sort of like a ice kind of planet where the winter winds are always threatening to overtake this like ski resort kind of place. And so there's this AI automated defense system which is constantly at war with nature. And so people come to this vacation spot in the summer, and then everyone leaves in the winter while the AI keeps the winter forced, the winds and ice and glaciers at bay. And so years before, this man had brought a woman to the planet, and she was like gonna pull him into a chasm, and so he cut the rope and left her to die. I forget all the exact details, but it's something along those lines. And so now he's in a new relationship, but he's broke, but his new girlfriend is wealthy. And so he gets her to fund a trip back to this planet so that he can dispose of the body more permanently and cover up his shameful deeds from the past. So Tom, overall thoughts on the story?
Yeah, it didn't really stick with me a bunch, but I enjoyed reading it. I thought it was a good story. I thought it had a kind of a Stephen King aesthetic to it, of somebody who maybe was a flawed character, and not maybe, but somebody who's a flawed character. And this guy's obviously he's not a great person. He left his previous. Did you say wife? Was it a wife or girlfriend?
I think it was girlfriend, but I don't remember exactly.
Okay, so he left his previous girlfriend to die, and then he gets together with this woman, obviously for her money, because he describes her in the story as not being very attractive, or the narrator describes her as not being very attractive, and he just wants her for her money, and then he's trying to ditch her, and then there's this sort of I don't know, retribution or karma coming back on him. And it was enjoyable to watch. It was enjoyable to experience. It was a good story. But I didn't absolutely love it.
Yeah. I mean, for me, this is another one where just the sheer unpleasantness of the main character kind of knocks it down a couple notches for me. And I mean, I like stories where, that are about evil characters or villainous characters or flawed, complicated characters or whatever. But just some of these stories, like, I just feel like the character is unlikable in a somewhat dull way, a way that doesn't really intrigue me at all. And that's kind of the case here. So, I mean, I think that the setup is really cool and the plot is interesting. But it's just not a story I would like reread over and over, because I just don't really care about the characters that much or really want to spend too much time with them.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
It is interesting how Zelazny came up with the idea. He said, I think he went on like a cruise in Alaska or something and saw all this ice, and that was kind of percolating in his mind. And then he drove down to California, and then he was like the only guest at this big hotel, and that kind of stuck in his mind. And then he was in an airport and he watched just this screaming fight between a husband and wife, just, screaming curses at each other. And those three elements all kind of came together and formed the story. And the ending of the story does really stick in my mind. I guess I won't go into too much detail, although this is a spoiler thing, but just the two forces screaming at each other at the end has always stuck in my mind, and I think is cool. But yeah, not one of my favorite Zelazny stories, just like I said, because of the characters don't really come alive that much for me.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It doesn't have when you were saying you don't like, you didn't like the character because he was unlikable and you didn't want to spend time with him. I was thinking of, there's so many stories I do like that have a horrible narrator, but they're short enough that you don't have to spend too much time in that person's mind, and so they're intriguing. But you're right. I think you're right that this one, the narrator you don't even really notice that he's a bad person until you get deeper into it and start reading more and more. Then you're like, oh, okay, I don't really think this guy's too good. And then by that time it's not in any kind of a, Cask of Amontillado sort of way where you're like, holy cow, this guy is horrible. And you're like fascinated by it.
Yeah. He's just sort of like a jerk, like people you might meet every day as a jerk. There's nothing sort of that elevates his jerkiness to something super intriguing to me.
Right.
All right. But so then now we're going to start getting into some where Tom and I have wild divergences of opinion.
Yeah.
So So Tom has his number one story from the book is Home is the Hangman. So this is a story. There's a group of scientists and they create this robot to explore deep space. And the robot seems to have come back to Earth to kill them one by one because of some dark secret that they're hiding. And the main character is this sort of secret agent sort of guy who was involved in creating the internet. And this story was written like in the 70s or something. So this is long before, at least, the internet was like a big thing. And so in the story, he was involved in creating it. And so he was able to kind of erase all mention of his existence from this global information network. So he kind of is able to assume, he's like one of the few people on Earth at this point who is able to assume any identity he wants. So that's kind of an interesting character. But so Tom, why is this your number one story from the book?
So this gets to the answer to why what I think, for me anyway, personally, is an insight into why Zelazny is such a favorite writer of mine and what he does so well. Or why he does it so well, I guess I should say. But I think what Zelazny does is similar to what, if you're a big fan of like Douglas Adams, say, because of his humor, Douglas Adams, there's like a laugh line every other sentence. There's like something funny. At least every paragraph has something funny in it. And same with Robert Sheckley. Like, you read his work and at least every paragraph has something that's just about laugh out loud funny. And I think Zelazny does the same thing, not with humor, but with emotion. I think he packs emotion into just about every paragraph. And I think the way he does it is by tapping into the senses, number one, tapping into his vast repertoire of, art and science and literature, number two, and by number three, just being a pleasant person. So it is what I said earlier, is you get to ride around in this pleasant person's mind for however long you're reading his work. I really think whether he's telling you a tragedy or a comedy or whatever it is, that you're always in this other person's mood and mindset, which is a very pleasant person to be in. And in the sense that any work of art is just taking an emotion and transferring it into some medium, which then can be downloaded by any person, whether that medium is, sculpture or a vinyl record or an MP3 or a book or a short story, or whatever it is. I think Zelazny is just the kind of person that, yes, I want to be involved with more of the emotions you're selling. I want to buy more of the emotions you're selling because your emotions are great. I want to feel like you felt. And I think that's what he does.
So Home is the Hangman. Why is that number one?
Pardon me. Because when I read Home is the Hangman, number one, it was very reminiscent of Doorways in the Sand because it did that same thing where the main character is always referencing how he feels about everything all the way through. Now, it's got a great plot. I don't want to short sell its plot. It's got great characters. It's got like cool scenes to it. The whole unfolding of the whole story is just really fun. And the way the mystery, I love a good mystery, and this is a mystery. This is very much a noir detective novella, but written on a science fiction landscape. And I just love that every scene in that book, every part of that book, I mean, from the way the guy talks about, how he sipped some coffee, or he had a sandwich, or he decided he was going to go get on a plane. You just feel this sense of immense comfort in your skin. And that's the only way that I can distill everything I'm trying to say about Zelazny. Is this is a guy, I believe, who felt very now he could, if he was still alive, maybe he'd laugh at me. But from reading everything I've read of him, I've read that he wrote, rather, I would say this is a guy who's very comfortable in his skin. And I would say that he does a good job of showing that to you and making you feel that way. And this Home is the Hangman, it's a fantastic story. I love the mystery of it. I love the what do you call it? The kind of flip flop at the end, the surprise at the end. I love I love the whole story, and I will probably read it over and over again. I think it's probably going to wind up being one of those rereadable things for me.
Okay,
But
so I was not crazy about the flip-flop at the end.
okay.
I mean, that was really my big problem with the story, because I went into this, I was like, I must have read this before, but I don't remember it, so it's probably not going to be amazing because it obviously didn't stick in my mind. But then as I was reading it, I was like, oh, this is actually really good. Maybe this is something that I should have remembered better. And yeah, I liked as the detective character is going around talking to the different scientists. I really liked the twist. I'm sorry, I'm just going to give away the whole story.
That's fine.
But the twist where the reason that the robot apparently is angry at the scientists is because they kind of like got drunk one night before they sent it off to space and decided to take it out for a spin and sort of, impress themselves with what it could do, that their design was so clever. And they end up seeing if they could rob a bank or, break into a bank vault. And in the process, inadvertently ends up killing a security guard and then covering it up. And so they've sort of traumatized this sentient robot, and that's why it has this grudge against them. So I thought all that stuff was really cool. I was really loving the story up till that point. But then there's this sort of, I thought, quite weird twist at the end where it turns out that actually the robot hasn't been killing them off one by one, that was just sort of like a weird misunderstanding, and other, that the people who have died for unrelated reasons, or for non-robot related reasons, or at least were not killed by the robot. And that the robot is totally benign and just sort of explains to the main character how wise and awesome it is, and then it goes off into space. And do you agree? Is that an accurate synopsis of what happens at the end of the story?
I don't think so, because I thought there was one death in the story that was unrelated, that was surprisingly unrelated. It was a coincidence. And there's actually a direct line from Doorways in the Sand where he says, he's explaining a similar thing at the end of that book, and he says, a coincidence, the one coincidence allowable in every story. The main character says that. And I think that's what's going on there, is there's one coincidence in the story, and that is that the robot didn't kill that first supposed murder victim. That's a trope I have seen in lots of film noir, not film noir, but noir detective novels. And so I don't fault him for that one. The second murder actually was a murder, but it was not the robot doing it, but I wouldn't classify it as unrelated. I would say that murder was directly related to the robot situation, but it was caused by another character. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. There was the psychiatrist character sent one of her patients to do something, and he ended up killing the victim, I think, is what happens.
Yeah.
But it's just, I just felt like the ending, I don't know. I liked the idea of the robot killing the people one by one, and how the hero was going to solve this problem. And I found the ending sort of deflating because he doesn't really have to do anything in the end. It turns out this robot was super cool all along. And so at the end, there's nothing really for the protagonist to do except kind of listen to the robot explain how wise it is. And so I just felt like that was not super satisfying to me from a plot standpoint.
I can see your point. I can totally see your point, because it does make the particular plot arc less satisfying. I guess I don't focus as hard on plot, and I guess that's the reason it works for me, which maybe I'm incorrect, because maybe, plot I know is very important, but I think the reason it works for me anyway is because I don't like I'm kind of tired of the idea of, the killer robot. And I think that's such an overdone thing. But I was thinking, well, this story was written a long time ago. I guess the killer robot thing was new back then. But I thought it was really cool that even back then he was saying, hey, maybe the killer robot really isn't a killer robot. Maybe it's us. Maybe if we design something that's so far in advance of us, it's actually going to, be kinder than us. I actually wrote a story about this and came very close to selling it to F and SF. I had a similar idea. But I like that idea of let's do away with this kind of tired old story of the robot goes berserk and starts killing everybody and do it a bit differently. So I think because of that, I didn't really care so much that it made the
I just
plot less
feel
satisfying.
like I would have found it more satisfying if it were set up a little bit more. It was one of those twists where it was kind of like, oh, that was weird, rather than, oh, of course, I see now,
Huh.
And I don't think killer robots will ever get old. I'll never get tired of killer robots. I mean, what's not to love about killer robots? But I totally agree with you about Zelazny. Like, what makes Zelazny such an appealing writer in pretty much all of his stories is that you just at least when it works, the protagonist is somebody that you just want to spend time with, that you fantasize about being. That I think Zelazny almost uniquely is an author who just seems like you're like, oh, I would want to be him. I would want to be a writer like this. I would want to write stuff like this. I mean, he just there's just something cool, like there's just something so, like, what's the word? It just like pulls you in and makes you want to be part of his world and his imagination and everything. And so I definitely, I can see, that this story does, this story obviously did that and worked for you. And I definitely, appreciate that because, like, so many of his stories, that's sort of like the near universal appeal of so much of his writing. I just really had a plot problem with this particular story.
Yeah, I think that's why he's so rereadable, is because you're like, yeah, do I want to feel like that again or do I not want to feel like that again? Of course I do. I'm going to go back and read this again. So, and as long as his stories keep making me feel like that, I'm always going to want to go back and feel that again. So I just think the insight I took from it is if you're trying to write a story, you should probably be focus not just on the emotional impact you're going to have at the end, but what does it feel like all the way through to the reader? And is there emotion everywhere? Maybe that's really hard to do. And maybe Zelazny never tried to do that. Maybe it was just because he was such an interesting, engaging, great person that just comes through when he writes. And probably arrogant too, I would say, just judging by his characters.
Yeah, well, I think... Yeah, just part of the particular alchemy of what makes him such a fascinating writer is that he was like, it seems, just a really nice, agreeable person who liked writing about jerks. And so there's sort of this balance or this very interesting, ambiguity or something to it. Whereas if it's like, a jerk writing about jerks, you're just like, this is just a jerk. Or if it's like a nice person writing about nice people, you're like, this is kind of boring. But if it's like a nice person writing about jerks, you're like, this is kind of interesting,
He must have had some arrogance, though, because I don't believe you could be that good of a writer as he was and not be somewhat arrogant. And also, there was a line in, I can't remember which of the stories, it was one of the stories in this anthology where there's a line where he says, everybody always told him he was super modest and that I'm completely paraphrasing because he would never use that word super, but everybody, had always told this guy he was super modest and that he was such a great guy, but inside he knew he was better than all of them at this. But it was just a fact, he was just really highly skilled. And I was thinking like he has to come from inside. Like he probably had, I will say, I don't think he was just arrogant and didn't know it. I think he probably was really good at what he did, knew it, and probably fought against arrogance, probably knew that was something base in himself and said, I don't want to be like that. But it probably rose up a lot in him and said like, no, you're really good at this.
Well,
and he's probably like, quiet. Shh.
Well, like there's something in one of the letters, he's offered the chance to, so Alfred Bester, who wrote like The Demolished Man and The Stars My Destination, when he died, he'd left like half of this manuscript for a book called Psycho Shop. And Zelazny was offered the chance to finish it. And it wasn't paying very well. But he's like, I feel like I have to do it because I'm the only science fiction writer who could do a good job. So yeah, I mean, I think there was some amount of arrogance. I mean, I think there's sort of like a fine line sometimes between arrogance and confidence if you're,
right.
If you have the chops to back it up.
Right.
But I don't think he was you know, there was some level of like, you know, being aware of his talent. You know, I mean, how could there not be?
Yeah, maybe that's not arrogance. I think arrogance is more like you think you're great, maybe above your ability level. But if you just know that you're really good at something, maybe that's just acknowledging something. So maybe that's a different animal.
Yeah. But so let's talk about the other story that you liked way more than me. This is He Who Shapes. This is a novella that Zelazny later expanded into his novel, The Dream Master. The premise is that there's this like therapist who treats his patients by using a machine to go inside their dreams, which creates this sort of like Freudian Jungian landscape where he's able to alter the landscape and, you know, affect a cure for their psychological distress.
Yeah.
And so I think that this story starts off really promisingly. I think that the premise is really cool. I think at the time it was probably super original. Zelazny, I think, did most of a undergraduate degree in psychology, and so he clearly knows his psychology. And, you know, it's impossible to read this story without coming away with the impression that this guy is a brilliant, incredibly knowledgeable person. My issue with the story is that I think it's a little like once the basic premise is established, it feels a little bit all over the place. There's like this like talking, seeing eye dog, and I feel like that never really goes anywhere. There's this love triangle that I feel like never really goes anywhere. There's like he's like getting letters from his son at boarding school or something that I feel like never really goes anywhere. And then I feel like the ending is kind of obvious, it's sort of like implicit in the setup, you know, that he's warned over and over again that this, there's this other, so the inciting incident is that he has this new patient who's this blind woman who also wants to be the sort of dream therapist that he is. And she's also intrigued by the idea that she'll be able to see in the dream world. But he's warned over and over again that she's like so strong-willed that he's in danger of being like subsumed by her will and trapped in her dream world forever. And then like dozens and dozens and dozens of pages later, that's what happens. And it's not like a big surprise or anything. So, you know, so I'm not crazy about the story. And I read the novel version a couple of years ago for our Dreams and Science Fiction panel. And I felt like there was like so much random stuff in the story. I was like, wow, he added so much random stuff to this to pad it out to novel length. But then you read the novella version, and it's like there's tons of random stuff even just in the novella version. So I don't know. I personally would have preferred a little bit more of a straight line plot. But maybe Tom, do you disagree with that or?
Wow, I can't disagree with any of what you said. I thought certainly the letters with the son and the dog, the seeing eye dog, and the love triangle. All of that stuff was really kind of thrown in there. And yes, you could tell you could tell from like almost the first few pages how it was going to end. So no, I those criticisms are all absolutely valid. I would say that I didn't mind that you could tell where it was going, because I felt like what he did a good job of here was setting up, here, I'm going to show you an immovable force, an irresistible force and an immovable object. And I'm going to introduce them both to you early on. And I'm going to put them on a collision course, and I'm going to let you watch this slow motion car crash between the two of them. And I'm going to make it really so engaging that you're not going to be able to look away. That's how I felt about that, the problem of, basically revealing the ending at the beginning. And then as far as the other stuff, I just sort of forgave that. You're right about the kind of random elements coming in and going out of the story. I just sort of forgave that because I thought they were kind of cool science fictional elements that Zelazny was into. I liked the guy. They didn't take up too much word space where I was like, why is this, why is he wasting so much time on this? I felt like it was, the dog, the talking, seeing eye dog was used to good effect as part of the story, where there had to be some way for him to realized that he had to get over to her apartment and check her out because she was having some kind of an episode. And I thought there was a lot of tension with the dog. And I know Zelazny really liked dogs, and he liked the idea of talking animals because he wanted to learn more about, he wanted to get closer to them. And I used to think that way too. And now I feel more like, oh, I'm so glad my dog can't talk. He'd constantly be going, can I go outside? Can I go outside? Can you give me a treat? Can I go outside? I'd be like, shh, quiet. But I thought Zelazny, those criticisms of yours are valid. But what had me about the story is the same thing I loved about Home is the Hangman. Is this is one of those stories where he excels at, even though this is a tragedy, at making you feel really good. And I think a big part of the way he makes you feel good throughout all his work is through the senses. So can I read a paragraph to show you what I mean?
Yeah.
So this is a paragraph that, by the way, this book, many people think it inspired the movie Dreamscape, which we never have watched as one of our awesome science fiction movies.
Well, it did. We talk about this in our Dreams and Science Fiction panel.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, because they hired Zelazny to write a treatment for Dreamscape, and he did. And then they completely rewrote it, and they ended up not giving him credit or using his treatment at all. But that is how the project got started. Yeah.
Okay. Well, as Mike Resnick used to say, the proper way for a writer to deal with Hollywood is to drop off the manuscript in a bag at the town line and have them drop a bag of money. But you start out the story thinking that this person is, I'll just set it up. I'm not reading it to show you the plot point. I'm reading it because to show you the aesthetic of it. But it starts out that you start out the story thinking this guy is just completely well adjusted and there's nothing psychologically wrong with him whatsoever. And then you learn that his family, I think his wife, and did he have a child as well, was killed in a car crash where he was driving back before there were self-driving cars, and he had his old manual powered car like we all have still, except for the Tesla owners, I guess. And his family is killed, and so he's walking through some snow, and it puts him in mind of this what happened. So here he is driving his self-driving car. He says, pushing his seat back into the center space, he left all the windows transparent. It was pleasant to half recline and watch the oncoming cars drift past him like swarms of fireflies. He pushed his hat back on his head and stared upward. He could remember a time when he had loved snow, when it had reminded him of novels by Thomas Mann and music by Scandinavian composers. In his mind now, though, there was another element from which it could never be wholly disassociated. He could visualize so clearly the eddies of milk-white coldness that swirled about his old manual steer auto, flowing into its fire-charred interior to re-whiten that which had been blackened, so clearly, as though he had walked toward it across a chalky lake bottom, it, the sunken wreck, and he, the diver, unable to open his mouth to speak for fear of drowning. And he knew, whenever he looked upon falling snow, that somewhere skulls were whitening. But 9 years had washed away much of the pain, and he also knew that the night was lovely. I mean, I bookmarked that when I read it because I just can't get my mind around the whole, he's got, Thomas Mann in there, he's got Scandinavian composers, he's got falling snow, something so sensual, he's got some super sense details of milk white coldness, flowing into the fire charred interior. He's got this is where he basically tells you that his family died in a car crash, and then he quickly steers away from that and says, he's doing much better now, and the night is lovely. And it's such a emotional roller coaster, that paragraph, and he does a lot of that in his stories that just takes me on a trip through, I don't know, through such a cool unfolding of emotions. It's like watching a rose bloom in stop motion or something. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no question that Zelazny is one of the most talented wordsmiths I've ever read. I mean, certainly in science fiction, but even just in literature in general. I think sometimes he goes a little overboard, and to me, along with doors of his face, lamps of his mouth. This is a story where it goes a little overboard. I mean, I love the paragraph you just read, but I feel like, there's too much figurative language and too many allusions in the story, to the extent that it just kind of like gets in the way of the plot a little bit too much. But I mean, that's a totally subjective thing. But just speaking for myself, I get a little impatient with it at a certain point. I mean, Theodore Sturgeon said the same thing about this story. Huh. But obviously other people will disagree. I mean, so yeah, I guess my other issues with the story is, again, I feel like the Charles Render character is like just a little bit too much of a dick. Wait, what's my other frequent, I mentioned, okay, that the figurative language is laid on a little too thick. Do you know about Zelazny's car accident in real life?
Yeah, I looked it up while I was reading this. I was wondering if he had ever been in a car crash, and I looked it up and saw that, yeah, he had been in a wreck it was described in the piece that I read as a horrible car crash, but then nobody was actually really seriously hurt, I guess. But it was a bad wreck, like it totaled the car and knocked him out.
That's not true. So the story, as I understand it, is that he was always a little bit of a distracted driver. He would just start like musing about something in his head and wasn't always paying super close attention to the act of driving. And so he was engaged. And so he and his fiance were driving somewhere at night, and he was in the driver's seat. And he just sort of like got a little mixed up and thought that they were on a highway where there were 2 lanes in each direction. And actually they were on a highway where there was 1 lane in each direction. And so he pulled out to pass a car in front of him, and they were in a head-on collision. And I think he was not too badly hurt, but his fiance was pretty badly hurt, to the extent that she could not have kids afterwards because of internal injuries. And that kind of like broke up their relationship. And so the image of the car wreck like recurs over and over again in his subsequent work, like in the Amber books. That's what, there's a car accident that kicks off the story. And it's just obviously something like he felt horrible about and had to process for years afterwards. And I think this was written not too long after that accident, this He Who Shapes.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh.
So yeah, I mean, so that aspect of the story is very, emotionally resonant. It's also just actually, speaking of Amber, it was kind of interesting to me because I feel like, I mean, as much as I'm not totally enamored with this story, I feel like the Amber books would probably never have come into existence if he hadn't written this story first, because just the idea that Charles Render, the shaper, is able to move amidst the dreamscape and change whatever details he wants, I feel like led directly to the idea of shadow walking in the Amber series. And there's a couple, this may be a little bit of a deep cut, but some of these lines, so there's a line I wrote down. This is like what's happened. This is some of the like kind of a little bit surreal imagery in the dream world. It says, "And the seas part to reveal stairways leading down, and arms emerge from caverns." And just the idea of a stairway leading down into the sea obviously reminds me of Rebma from Nine Princes in Amber. And the idea of arms, reaching out of cavern walls recurs in Night of Shadows. And then I don't even know what this has to do with this story at all. I was a little lost at this point, but there's a whole thing where like Kabbalah comes into it, Jewish mysticism.
Right.
And this is what it says. It says, "I beat you and I chained you for Rothman." Yes, it was Rothman, the Kabbalist. "He traced a pentagram in the air. Return to Qliphoth, I banish you." And this is very, very similar to the scene in Trumps of Doom where Victor Melman, so it's Melman, not Rothman, lures Merlin into this like Kabbalistic painting of the Kabbalistic tree of life and tries to sacrifice him there. So as a big Amber fan, it was just interesting to me. how these things kind of recurred later, or how they were prefigured in this story.
Yeah, that must have been kind of fun finding those little Easter eggs throughout.
Yeah. So the next ones that you liked a lot more than me, and actually, okay, well, so Divine Madness, this is a story where there's a guy who suffered a tragedy, and he starts experiencing episodes which he initially thinks may be, like neurological or something, where time seems to be going backwards. And then eventually he has one that lasts so long that it goes back. I think his wife, they had a fight and she left and then she died in a car accident. I forget the exact details, but it's something along those lines. Yeah. And then time gets rewound back to the point where he's able to stop her. He's able to say he's sorry in the middle of the argument and prevent her from storming out. So I thought this was like fine, but not super memorable. Again, kind of like underdeveloped. But so do you disagree with that, or did you see more in the story than I did?
No, I wasn't completely blown away by it as a Zelazny story, but I thought it was a really fun story, really cool. I was, starting out wondering where is it going to go, because he has this little episode where he's like, oh no, it's happening again, and things rewind, and he explains, like, it was clever how it wasn't just like, oh, time is going backwards. He's like, well, I've talked to my doctor about this. My doctor says it's a weird symptom of my epilepsy, that time is not really flowing backwards. It just feels that way to me, but I swear, like, I'm going backwards. Like, it's how it feels to me. And then you're thinking, okay, well, that's interesting. And then it keeps happening longer and longer. And then it eventually goes back before when his fiance died. And then he's able to make a different choice that time, and things are different. So I just thought that, I don't know, I just thought it was cool. I thought it was really cool. I didn't want to put it above the other stories that I thought were even cooler, but no, I liked it. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a story. I mean, you put this as number 6, so yeah. I definitely wouldn't put it that high, but I mean, again, there's nothing wrong with it. I just thought, it was a little straightforward for me. Yeah. It's kind of interesting, actually. So how this story came to be written is that Zelazny, he had been engaged. This was a different fiance. He had been engaged to the folk singer Hedy West, and they were engaged for about 6 months, and then he broke things off. Like, that relationship kind of ended, and then shortly after that he found out that his father had died, and so he wrote 3 to sort of process his grief. He wrote 3 stories in one day, and this was one of the 3 that he wrote that day. That's one of the worst days of his life. So yeah, that's kind of interesting that he was, even in those circumstances, he was, so prolific. I read that in a introduction that he wrote to this story in another anthology, and that he had done that. And I was blown away by the idea that anybody could write 3 published science fiction stories in one day, let alone, after a loved one had died, and when you're feeling, and you have a breakup and you're feeling horrible. But on the other hand, he said something, there was some line to the effect that he just had this horrible mood that made him want to write, that made him want to sit down and just write something on paper rather than face what he was dealing with, which made a lot of sense to me. If that's the way that he handled being in a bad mood, then that's what he did, I guess. But still amazing to me that he was able to write 3 stories that, made a lot of sense. But I also read that I think I read this, that he actually had epilepsy. And I never had read that about him before, but that some of the, the sensory details he would put in, I read that sometimes he would try to induce, and correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, no, Warren Lapine talked about this in my interview. Oh, that's where it was. Okay, thank you. Yes, it was not something I read. It was in your podcast. Yeah, that he had epilepsy and he would try to induce it so that he could write more like vivid stuff. Yeah, I mean that's what Warren says in that interview, and he would know. I don't recall ever seeing that mentioned anywhere else before. Okay. Which says, I think, a lot about how private of a person Zelazny was, because, I mean, there's, in one of these Nesfa Press books, I think it's Joe Haldeman says that one time he was hanging out with his brother and Zelazny and maybe one other person, and they went jogging, and Zelazny had like a seizure, and they were all, really concerned about him. But then he was just like, no, I was just exhausted, didn't get enough to eat or something,
Huh.
So even, and I assume that was an epileptic seizure that he had, but he was so like private about his health that he, didn't want to talk about it. And then, very famously, he was dying of cancer, and he didn't, he just told like a couple of close friends. And so it was a huge shock to the whole science fiction community when he died, because like nobody had any idea that he was, that he was that ill. So it is interesting, again, just, that he never, he had his like privacy that he guarded very carefully.
Yeah.
Even extending to his, political views and stuff, which is going to come in to my comments about our next story. So I guess let's get into that. So this is another one that you rated significantly higher than I did, although I had it number 7. So, pretty, reasonably high. This is The Last Defender of Camelot. And so the premise is that Lancelot is immortal, and this is, Lancelot from the King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. He's found that he's immortal and has lived into the present day, and then meets Morgan Le Fay, right, who also has lived into the present day. And she tells him that the reason that he's immortal is because Merlin cast a spell on him, because Merlin wanted a servant around when he woke from his 1,000-year slumber in the crystal cave, and that Merlin has just awoken, and so Lancelot goes looking for Merlin. And
Yeah.
I read this as a kid, and I thought it was okay. I sort of remembered it as just like, oh yeah, Lancelot is in modern times, and he fights this like suit of armor, and there's not a whole lot to the story, but it's like okay. Reading it now, I actually liked it quite a bit more, for reasons I'll go into. But so Tom, kind of what were your just overall thoughts on this story?
Yeah, wait until you're 55 and then read it again. I'm going to read it again when I'm 65, if I'm still around, or 75. I thought it was really cool. I wonder if it didn't inspire Highlander, or the whole series of movies and shows. But I think it's really fun. You start out with this cool scene where this old man is attacked by muggers, and he just dispatches all of them really quickly. And you're like, wow, what's this guy got going on? And then he goes in and he meets Morgan Le Fay, and then he doesn't realize it's her at first, and she doesn't realize it's him. And then they recognize each other, and they have this kind of, oh my gosh, I haven't seen you in so long. What have you been up to? Like, how's everything been going for the past, 1,000 years or whatever? And, they discuss things, and then she says, well, Merlin, there never was a Holy Grail. And he's shocked to hear that. And she says, it's just Merlin did it to try to give you a quest so you could all unify over something. And then she says, but, Merlin's not dead either. He was frozen by a spell, and he's going to come back. And Lancelot's like, well, I don't know why I'm still here. And she says, well, I think he put a spell on you so that you would still be around when he's awake, because he's going to be in a strange place, and he wants somebody who's a friend of his. So he says, well, why are you telling me this? And she says, well, I want to tell you, he's not who you think he is. He's kind of a megalomaniac, kind of a psychotic, and he's going to, and think what he's, if he could do what he did back then, think what he can do now in today's world with all the power that's floating around in the world. And he says, well, I don't trust you. You're Morgan Le Fay. And she says, well, just think about it. And, I know you're a rational person. I know you're a good person. I know you're devoted to Camelot and devoted to protecting people. Just think about it. And so years go by, and he does meet up with Merlin when Merlin awakens. And by then he's thought about what she said enough to think probably, well, I'm going to put him to the test. So when Merlin wakes up, he runs him through this conversation where it very quickly becomes clear that Merlin is a megalomaniac and psychotic, and he's going to do something horrible. And it also becomes very clear that he's not going to be able to do anything about it, because Merlin is so powerful his power comes back very quickly. And at the same time, there's a very satisfying, to my mind, way that that Lancelot is able to turn the tables on Merlin. And I just loved it. I loved the whole story. I loved again, I'm blinded a lot by the aesthetic that Zelazny puts into everything, the sense details and the emotion that he packs into everything, to the point where it clouds my view of story, I think. So yeah, all your criticisms about He Who Shapes were true, but it didn't change my enjoyment. And the same thing here. You may have criticisms about this story. I'm sure you will, but I'm sure you do, or you outlined some of them already. But I don't know. I feel like maybe my critical faculties are blinded a bit by how it makes me feel.
Well, so. Yeah, I don't actually have too many criticisms of the story. My sort of main criticism or whatever, I guess, that I remembered was just that I didn't feel it was a standout story particularly, but I didn't have any big issues with it. But I like it a lot more. So you said, well, read it when you're 55, right? And I think that's really telling because, when I read this as a teenager, I was like, this is all right, But the thing that really strikes me as a much older person is this idea that So you say Merlin is kind of like psychotic and stuff. Like, I mean, maybe that's true, but I thought what I really like about the story is that Merlin is not merely like a evil, mad wizard kind of thing. His issue is that he's an ideologue. He's a misguided idealist, and he just, back in the good old days, he tried to use the Knights of Camelot to enforce his moral vision over the country. And he's determined to keep doing that in the present day. And Lancelot, having lived through, so Merlin, as we said, has been asleep this whole time. And Lancelot, having lived through all these centuries and having all these centuries of life experience, is now, jaded and suspicious of people who want to, like, impose their moral vision over the whole world. And that was the thing that I found really fascinating reading it now. And that is, far and away my favorite part of the story. I was just going to read. So this is sort of like a mashup of expressing Lancelot's perspective, basically. He says, "The longer I lived, the more difficult it became to determine what was wrong and who was wicked. I've lived too long, seen too much, know too much of how the world works now to trust any one man's opinion concerning its salvation. I'm just saying that you should avoid using your powers in any attempt to effect social change as we once did, by violence." And as a teenager, I think I just sort of, read over that, and it didn't hit me very hard, but it definitely hits me hard as as you say, as like a 46-year-old man who's seen too much of misguided idealism.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, that is something I like about the story as well. Yeah.
I mean, I don't have too much more to say about the story. I really liked that aspect of it. Interesting trivia. So George R. R. Martin adapted this into an episode of The Twilight Zone in the 80s. And I guess I still haven't seen it. I should probably track that down. But one interesting thing is that one of the stuntmen had his nose cut off during the, in a freak accident while filming the sword fighting scene.
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah.
Well, they apparently weren't using fake swords.
Yeah, so I don't know any more about that, but I did read that. Sorry if I'm for having a little bit of a downer, some downer material on this episode, but
man.
But yeah, so that was Last Defender of Camelot. Okay, so now we're getting into the stories that I liked way more than Tom. So I think first, I guess I'll bring up Damnation Alley. Now I had read, so this is a novella that Zelazny later expanded into a novel, and I had read the novel, back when I was around 20 or something, maybe. And I remembered it being not that good, kind of silly. That the premise is that there's this like badass biker guy. It's in a post-apocalyptic America, where I think everything's been destroyed except San Francisco and Boston. And all the intervening geography is filled with like giant mutated snakes and scorpions and stuff like that. And so the people in Boston are dying of some plague. And so they have to get a vaccine to them, but you can't fly because of, monsters in the like giant bats and some sort of like weird air currents and stuff like that. So the only way to get the vaccine to them is to drive a sort of like battle tank thing across the country through all the mutated giant monsters. And so they get this guy Hell Tanner, who's this like Hell's Angel biker who's been in prison, and tell him they'll give him a pardon and let him out of prison if he makes this drive, because he's I think he's like the only person who's ever like he like did it halfway one time. So they figure he has the best chance of making it. And so it all sounds kind of silly. I think that was sort of my memory of it. And this is like a story, I think it's like famously regarded as one of Zelazny's worst stories. I read recently an introduction that Samuel R. Delany wrote to a Zelazny book where he spends an inordinate amount of time, in my opinion, talking about how bad this story is. In the introduction to this book, Lisa Tuttle says she would have not included it. I was reading in the George R. R. Martin introduction I read last night. He says something like, I love everything Zelazny ever wrote. Yes, even Damnation Alley. So I went into this with rock bottom expectations, and I actually like really enjoyed it. I mean, there's some like problems with it toward the end that I'll get into, but I've just read so much stuff recently, like Stranger in a Strange Land. It was just so boring. And so just to read something that just was not boring was really refreshing to me. This is like balls out, like balls to the wall action, nonstop, gunfights, giant snakes, flamethrowers, like you name it. I actually found it really fun. So, maybe on another day I would have ranked it lower, but what did I rank it? I ranked it 4. So I actually quite enjoyed it. But Tom ranked it 11 out of 13. So what did you think, Tom, of Damnation Alley?
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have ranked it so low because I think it was the first one I read out of the anthology, so I think my memory of it has faded somewhat. But I think I'm not as much of a science fiction critic as I am just a product of my times. So I think that what maybe dims it a little bit for me is, number one, the first way I encountered it was through the movie when I was in high school.
Oh no.
Yeah, which was awful. It didn't even look like science fiction hardly the way they did it. I mean, you're looking at the vehicle and you're thinking, why is that futuristic? I don't get it. But
yeah, let me just explain. So Zelazny sold the rights to Hollywood for this novel, and they had shown him he had no control over the production at all.
Right.
And so they had shown him some script that followed the book fairly closely. And so he thought like, oh, this will be fine, But then when he went to see it in the theater, it turned out they had hired someone, like the studio wasn't happy with the script. And so they had hired someone to rewrite it and apparently change it beyond recognition from anything in his book. Yeah. And also, I'm not 100% sure of this, but I think it's something like the same studio was making Star Wars or something, and they had to like pull all the budget from Damnation Alley to pay for the special effects in Star Wars. So there's like all sorts of shots which are more or less like temporary shots that made it into the finished movie because, they never finished the special effects. So I've never seen it, but it's famously terrible.
Yeah, it was absolutely horrendous. And actually, I think I had seen that movie before I encountered Roger Zelazny. And then I think when I started reading Zelazny and I found this and I read it, I was like, wait a minute, this is for that horrible movie. And then when I read the book, which I had read, years ago when I was young, I was thinking, well, this isn't anything like that movie. But then secondly, 2 movies since he wrote this novella did it better. One is Road Warrior, with with Mel Gibson, the second Mad Max movie, which I think there's no question that is it Ridley Scott? No, he was Aliens, right? Who did?
No, it was George Miller.
George Miller did the Mad Max movies.
Yeah.
Okay, so I feel like he must have been a big fan of this book, particularly if you watch the newer Mad Max, the one, not the one that's coming out right now, but there was one that came out, or maybe there's a series coming out right now, but there was a movie that came out a few years ago.
Well, you're talking about Fury Road that came out like 10 or 12 years ago or something.
Right. Okay. 10 or 12. Okay. Yeah. Time's speeding up on me.
I think. So, I'm not sure. I think it was something like that. It was called Fury Road anyway. That's the one we're talking about.
And that was a Mad Max movie. So there is a scene in it that is lifted straight out of this book where they have to drive through this gauntlet of tornadoes, of dust devils, massive dust devils.
Huh. Yeah.
And that is when I saw that, I was like, okay, because I was already thinking this is so much like Mad Max, except for the giant monsters, which were probably too hard to do with special effects. And then also, holy cow, Escape from New York, with the Snake Plissken character is pulled straight, is the main character of this book. There's no, and even the scene at the beginning where he's saying, oh, we've got you, and you're going to either go to jail for life, or we can have you do this impossible mission. And he's like, I don't do that stuff, and I don't care about anybody. And it's the same exact setup, and it's the same character. And Damnation Alley, the novella, came first. But those are done so much better that reading this now was more like, okay, yeah, no, I know they ripped him off, but they perfected it. And it's harder for me to go backwards and enjoy this. But I still did like it. I mean, I still read it, and I wouldn't go along with those critics who are like, oh, it's the worst thing he ever did. I don't agree with that at all. I think it's a very good book. I just, compared to his other stuff, I just thought, well, I gotta put it lower down. So,
I guess interesting context. I think Zelazny had been in, I think it was the Ohio National Guard or something like that, and he had met some, like ex-con biker guy, and he said it was the only time that he ever based a character. They just basically took someone he knew in real life and basically just plugged them into a story, and he thought it would be interesting to have a story where there's like a bad guy character who does something incredibly good against his will, and sort of explore the idea of, is he a hero? Does your deeds make you a hero, or your choices make you a hero? So that's kind of interesting. I mean,
yeah.
So, but the thing that's really I think a glaring weakness of this story is the female character.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
He introduced about, I don't know, 2/3 of the way through or something. He introduces this like biker chick, Cornelia, and she's just like totally one-dimensional, and their relationship, it feels just very like, okay, it's the point in the story where the hero has to get a hot chick sidekick,
Yeah.
But it's totally unpersuasive and one-dimensional and stuff. So that definitely brought it down a couple of notches when I got to that part. And then the ending goes a little abrupt. I feel like Zelazny's endings, are not always, like abrupt, like sort of weird abruptness is something that, recurs in some of his stories. Yeah. Notably, the 10-volume Amber series, if you read that far, has a really weirdly abrupt ending. But again, like I just had a really good time reading this story. I mean, I'm, it's not, not classic literature or anything, but it reminds me. But yeah, again, it's just like nonstop action. It kind of reminds me of the part in Nine Princes in Amber where Corwin is marching his army against Amber, and it's just like one batshit insane action thing after another, and it kind of reminded me pleasantly of that.
Yeah.
So, I had a good time. Okay, but then we're going to get into these last three stories we're going to talk about, which I think are just stone cold classics, just absolute genius. But I liked The Keys to December a lot more than Tom did. So we can talk about that. But so the keys to December, there are these sort of cat-like genetically engineered colonists who this company created in order to settle a very cold planet. But then the cold planet that they were intended to settle is destroyed in a supernova. So they have nowhere to live except like freezer chambers. And so one of them, our hero, Jerry Dark, he makes a lot of money on the stock market. And then he buys a planet where they all can live on, and they're going to terraform it to make it cold enough for them to live comfortably there. But and they're going to like go into hibernation. This is going to take like 3,000 years or something. And so they're going to go into hibernation, and they're just going to wake up periodically and kind of check on how things are going. But then it turns out that there's this race of like unintelligent, bipedal aliens living on this planet, but the evolutionary pressures put upon them by the terraforming machines cause them to become more intelligent, and they start like using tools and having religion and stuff like that. So Tom, overall thoughts on the keys to December?
I thought it was a cool story. I just, again, had to put it lower because I like the other ones better, but it's kind of like, I don't know, you have what's your favorite 10 foods and now rank them in order. It's like, well, I don't know. I guess I have to put some of them lower down, but it doesn't mean I don't like them. So I thought it was a cool story. I thought the setup was, what a cool idea to have this, genetically engineered life form that now has nowhere to live because the place it was going to live is now destroyed. What a cool character. And then a really cool idea to have the character create this or get this world terraformed, and then, find out that, oh no, now there's going to be life. And then go from thinking, no, I absolutely want this world terraformed to be like me. I don't care if it hurts the indigenous population. There's nothing intelligent there. I don't care. To being the one who has to fight for it, and even fight his own kind to protect it, was a really cool story arc. So yeah, I liked it.
Yeah, I just again, I think this story is total genius. And this is like the main character. His name is Jerry Dark again. He's like a perfect Zelazny hero to me because he's, recalcitrant and iconoclastic and witty and everything. But then he also has this heart of gold I was talking about, where he sees that this alien life form, through no fault of their own, has been, gifted or cursed with sentience, and it's his responsibility in it. And so he feels it's his responsibility to do something about it. And so he becomes like basically like an eco-terrorist to force his compatriots to show mercy to this native life form. And I just think that's a great story. There's just one part. This is the part that's always stuck in my mind, the sort of paragraph. So I just wanted to read this because I think this is great. This is what he says to his compatriots. He says, "I am their god. My form is to be found in their every camp. I am the slayer of bears from the desert of the dead. They have told my story for 2.5 centuries, and I have been changed by it. I am powerful and wise and good, so far as they are concerned. In this capacity, I owe them some consideration. If I do not give them their lives, who will there be to honor me in snow, and chant my story around the fires, and cut for me the best portions of the woolly caterpillar? None, Turl. And these things are all that my life is worth now. Awaken the others. You have no choice."
Huh.
And that just gives me, it gives me chills reading it. I think it's so good.
Yeah, it's really cool.
So yeah, I read this years ago, originally in an anthology that Gardner Dozois edited of terraforming stories. And it's always stuck in my mind as the best of them. So yeah, I love the story basically unreservedly. Yeah, I think I have no criticisms that I can think of.
Yeah, it's cool. It's a very cool story. I didn't mean to say it was a bad story. I just like the other ones better, but it's definitely a fun story.
Yeah, so everyone definitely go check that one out. Okay, and so then we have the two that Tom and I both agree are awesome. So I guess first let's talk about A Rose for Ecclesiastes. So this was the first Zelazny story that really made him a well-known author. It just kind of blew everyone away when it came out. And so the premise is that there's this, again, very arrogant poet. If you didn't know, Zelazny wanted to be a poet, but decided he couldn't make a living as a poet, so turned to science fiction. But so anyway, so there's this very arrogant poet, and he goes to Mars, and this is, again, like I said with the Venus story, this is like the Edgar Rice Burroughs Mars, where there's a breathable atmosphere and a native Martian race and stuff like that, and dying cities and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, so this arrogant poet goes to Mars in order to translate their holy books, and takes a lover among the Martians, and gets this sort of inkling that there's kind of some secret the Martians are keeping, but he initially doesn't know what it is. So Tom, what'd you think of A Rose for Ecclesiastes?
I really liked it for so many reasons. I liked I read somewhere that it was a story of old Mars. Old Mars being what science fiction authors used to think, or what everybody used to think Mars might be back before we had telescopes and probes, powerful telescopes and probes that would tell us better. When we first had rudimentary telescopes and we could see what we thought were canals on Mars, then we thought maybe there's a civilization there. And they said, oh, this is a story of that Mars. And I disagree. I don't think it is. I think, it starts out where there's a part in it where Zelazny says, these are the so-called canals that people thought were canals back before we knew better. But his race of aliens is underground. And so it's a little more actually of a new Mars story, but set with the aesthetic of old Mars. Just he uses some devices to get us back there with our current understanding. So I thought it was clever in that way, but obviously the emotional impact of it is the main thing here, and what I think makes people love it so much. That the main character, who is, as you say, very arrogant, winds up falling in love with this Martian woman in the course of trying to decipher these alien texts and trying to sort of translate their language and learn their language, and then realizes that there's something really important going on here in the planet and with the civilization. And he starts to realize that the civilization is dying and that they're not going to be around much longer. And so then he realizes that one thing he needs to do is he needs to translate this book of the Bible for them. And that becomes sort of his mission. And because he's so brilliant, he's able to do it brilliantly. And then he's able to, mainly I think because of his failing relationship with this Martian woman, he realizes he needs to read this book of the Bible to them and then show the Martians why he thinks this particular book of the Bible is A, beautiful, B, very coincident with their current understanding of why things are hopeless, and C, how Earthlings have moved on from there and still have a vibrant planet and civilization. And it's super clever how he takes the story through the arc from the main character's emotional arc and the Martian's emotional arc, and kind of reaches both to a crescendo at the same time. And that's pretty fun to watch.
Yeah. So just to be clear, so the Martians have been infected with a plague, which has caused them to be infertile. And so their religion and they live for centuries. And so their religion over the past few centuries has developed that they should just die out, that's sort of nature taking its course. And then when he gets this Martian girl pregnant, it proves that actually, if the Martians intermarry with humans, that they will, that they can have offspring. And so then that makes him highly motivated to convince them that their religion is wrong, which he does, as Tom is saying, by comparing their religion with the book of Ecclesiastes. And so there's like kind of a crazy twist at the end. Which I guess I'll just get into. So there's a crazy twist at the end where it turns out that actually everything he did was actually like part of a prophecy that the Martians had, that this prophet was gonna come and like reform their religion, and then they weren't gonna die out after all. And so everything he's done has just been playing a part in their religion, and this relationship he had with this Martian woman was all just kind of like set up by the Martians from the start. And then he's very upset about that at the end. And it's like just a super cool story. It's interesting because Zelazny wrote this and then didn't submit it anywhere because he felt like he had to like just put in, I felt like I'd put in everything, including the Martian kitchen sink. And he was also a little bit afraid that, people would judge him for having still the sort of pulp Edgar Rice Burroughs vision of Mars. So he actually held off on submitting the story for a while, which is just to me such an interesting, interesting commentary on how writers, you can never really know if what you've done is good or not, because this is like, by far his most famous story that's still being read and admired, decades later. And he wasn't even sure he wanted to submit it. So
that's interesting. Get
your stuff out there, people. You never know, I guess.
You never know. It's interesting to me that I think he kind of misses the point of the book of Ecclesiastes in a weird way, that, his point in there is that the book of Ecclesiastes says, just give up because everything is hopeless. I think Ecclesiastes is such a bizarre thing because it doesn't seem to fit in the rest of the Bible. It's almost more like a Taoist text or a Greek Stoic text or a Buddhist text, where it just says, look, everything is meaningless. So don't look for meaning where you normally would think to look for it. Don't look for it in riches or fame or fun times or any of that. And it's interesting to me that where he ultimately, it's held to be written by King Solomon, who's supposed to have been the wisest person in the Bible. And it ultimately comes back to what he ultimately says you should look for it in is you should look for it in the work of in what you're actually doing in the moment. So come back to the moment. And then there's a part at the end where it says that somebody else comes in and says, hey, we want to let you know that the narrator means like you should turn your heart to God. And but it's not 100% clear that is what Solomon is saying, although that's personally what I agree with that meaning of it. But it's funny to me that what Solomon actually says in his own words is you should just be here now. Don't try to find meaning in any achievement. Just be here now, because that's the only place that's the only thing you have is right now. And so it's funny to me that my favorite thing about Zelazny is exactly that he does that he is always like puts you right in the moment and puts you in the sensory experience of things. And yet I feel like he kind of missed that in this story, missed that intellectually, but not, he actually does it in this story too. He puts you in that sensory experience, but he kind of misses the lesson there.
Yeah, I read the book of Ecclesiastes a very long time ago, so I don't feel like I could really comment on what its meaning is. I mean, obviously Zelazny, just because the character says this about the book doesn't mean that's how Zelazny himself felt about it.
That's a good point.
But I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there is, because I'm very, sympathetic to just ideas of stoicism and making peace with the fact that there's things you can't change. But so I thought it was interesting though that this story, makes the point that like most of the time that's good advice, but there are situations where you don't want to be stoic. Like if your whole race is dying out, that's a time you might want to not make peace with that and really go to extreme measures to do something about that. So I think it does make the story interesting that it engages with, the idea of stoicism or whatever in that kind of interesting way.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Like I guess he's, they've taken stoicism to the extreme and saying, hey, we're going to die. And that's supposed to happen. So we're just going to be like happy with that. And he's saying, well, yeah, no, we kind of, we're at that place too, but we've moved beyond that. And we think you should too. And then, like you say, there's this cool twist where they're like, oh, we kind of knew you were going to tell us something. We didn't know what it was going to be, but we knew you were here to do it. So, and that works for us. That's satisfying. So we'll take that and run with it. Thank you. And your whole relationship has been a farce because it's been designed to lure you in and get you to prophesy this to us.
But I mean, Zelazny was, he had this like very intensely spiritual side, but he balanced it with this very strong scientific rationalist side. And so I think the story is taking a rationalist position. There was a line I underlined that I thought was interesting. He says, this is Gerencer, the poet, speaking. He says, "It is vanity, it is pride. It is the hubris of rationalism to always attack the prophet, the mystic, the god. It is our blasphemy which has made us great and will sustain us, and which the gods secretly admire in us." So I thought that was an interesting way of expressing that. I mean, but Zelazny is coming at it from I think from a rationalist perspective, not a religious perspective in this story.
Right. It reminds me of the funny line in the excellent movie Penguins of Madagascar where they see an egg rolling away and all the penguins are like, "Oh, we can't chase that and save it. We're just penguins, we're just cute and cuddly." And one of the penguins is like, "Yeah, you're right. But I guess it is just nature, but something in me tells me it makes no sense at all." And he says, "I reject nature." and they all gasp. But it's that kind of rising up against the assumed, like, well, this is the boundary. This is the line outside which we can't step. And Zelazny's saying, no, look, you can definitely step there if you have to.
But then again, just the way that you have that reversal at the end just complicates the story. Gerencer makes this big rationalist argument, but it turns out his whole rationalist argument has just been a tool of this alien religion the whole time. So,
yeah, you're right. That's cool.
Yeah, so I think this is again a super cool story, total work of genius. So yeah, and this is definitely one like everyone you have to read it if you're a science fiction fan at all.
Maybe that's why people like it so much is because I could never, I like the story, but I could never, and I'd read it 20, 30 years ago and I read it now and I still can't quite wrap my head around why do people like it so much. I like it, but I don't get why it's so much better than the others. Maybe that's it, is because he takes you on this journey of let's fight against this assumed religion thing and go to rationalism, and then yes, that wins, and then it turns out in a larger kind of shell within a shell, no, it doesn't win. Maybe that kind of double switch makes people like it so much.
Yeah, I think just the fact that it's not straightforward, that you can keep worrying at it and wondering, like, wait, what is going on here?
Yeah.
I also just the scene where, so there's this scene where Gerencer wants to get in to see his Martian girlfriend, and there's like this giant like Martian guard guarding the temple, and Gerencer has to fight him with his martial arts skills. Like that is just like, so I don't know, that something that has really stuck in my mind too. Just just this idea of this sort of poet who's this expert martial artist, but he's a little out of practice, and he knows he basically has like one shot to take this guy down, or else or else he has no chance. And he does it, cool. and it's really persuasive how it's described. Yeah, I don't know. It's a great story. Everyone check it out. No notes. Oh, go ahead.
Similar to how the main character beats the robot in Home is the Hangman. Doesn't beat him, but almost beats him in Home is the Hangman, this giant all-powerful robot, and he manages to use judo on it to almost defeat it. That was kind of cool.
Yeah, there's this great line about, well, its feet are pointing this way and this way, and so that means that you have to hit it here in order to knock it over. Like, Zelazny's martial arts training really, again, just brings up the level of some of these fight scenes.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get to our last story. This was the one I put as number 1. Tom had it as number 3. It's called For Breath I Tarry. And so the premise is that there's, I guess, been a big nuclear war or something. Humanity is extinct, and the only inhabitants of Earth are these AI systems, these like super powerful, almost godlike AI systems. And so our main character is named Frost, and he's this sort of like, there was some like quirk of his creation where he's a little bit different from the other AIs. And he's just fascinated by the extinct humans and wants to know everything about them, and makes various efforts to understand what it's like, or like what humanity was. But since he's a robot, he can never really understand it. And so ultimately he contrives to have his consciousness, his like digital consciousness, transferred into a biological human body so that he can experience what it's actually like to be human. So Tom, what'd you think of For a Breath I Tarry?
Well, I loved it, and I apologize if I'm a little fuzzy on the details. It was I think it was the second one I read, but I loved it. I thought the Faustian bargain he enters into with the sort of barbell-shaped robot is kind of cool. You've got this AI, is all-powerful AI in orbit, and then you've got one deep underground. And they're kind of warring, because the one underground wasn't supposed to be activated unless the one in orbit was damaged. And then the one in orbit was damaged, so the one underground was activated, but then the one in orbit managed to repair itself. But the one underground is like, I don't care, that's my programming, is I take over when you're damaged. And the one in orbit's like, no, you take over when I'm damaged beyond repair. And he's like, I don't see it that way. And so they have this cool enmity going on, and then they all have their own minions. And Frost is a minion of you get the idea that the one orbiting is the good one, and the one underground is kind of the devil figure. Even though they never explicitly say that, but there are things that the one underground wants to do that seem a little wrong. But they all have their own minions, and so Frost is this minion of the good one. And he's in charge of the northern hemisphere, and there's another one in charge of the southern hemisphere. And then there's all these smaller like robots that they've created, that those smaller minions have created, these even smaller minions that roam the earth and that try to rebuild the world to fit a humanity that's gone forever. There's no people left. There's not going to be any more people. And so they're trying to rebuild this for no purpose. But the orbiting one, the good one, is trying to rebuild it. And then the one underground, the bad one, is trying to destroy what the orbiting one is making and trying to make his own version of it. And then the one orbiting is trying to destroy the underground one's version of what the world should look like. So they're always fighting each other. They're always in battle. And then this one little robot comes up to Frost, the good AI minion of the orbiting robot, and says, I want you to prove to me that you could ever. And this is by the way, this is by an argument, almost straight out of the book of Job, between the good AI and the bad AI, where they have this argument, and they say, no, you shouldn't be in control. I should be in control. No, it's the other way around. Is there any way we can ever prove that that man would say which of us should be in charge? And then the good one says, well, have you ever met my servant Frost? So then that argument starts this Faustian bargain, where this minion comes up to Frost and says, the minion is basically a barbell shaped robot with a turret on top. And it rolls up to Frost and it says, hey, do you think you could ever, we've noticed that you really like humankind a lot. Do you think you could ever, become a man? And Frost is like, yeah, I think I could. And he's like, well, I don't think you could. And he's like, and I bet you can't. And if you lose the bet, he's like, then you're going to have to go down underground and be in the service of this bad AI for the rest of eternity. And Frost says, yeah, you're on. I think I can do it. And he spends the rest of the story trying to figure out, how do I become a human? And he starts out with trying to figure out all the things that humans were and try like, well, maybe if I had eyes, he makes some eyes. And he's like, no, it didn't make me human. He tries all these different things. And then finally, Dave, I'll let you take it from here. But I just love that setup of that Faustian bargain of like, there's good versus evil. And the way they're going to settle their argument is by making this proposal, by having the evil one make this proposal to a minion of the good one and say, look, if you can do this thing, then you get your way. But if you can't do this thing, then you're going to be in our service from now on. And so it's crazy because it sets up, there's no people in this story, right? You would think that in order to become emotionally involved with the story, you'd have to have people. And these things clearly aren't just, he's not just saying, well, this is an AI, but really we know it's a person. It's not. The way he writes it, you can tell it's not a person. You can tell it's a computer. It's an AI. But you still are very, very engaged and emotionally involved throughout the whole thing. It's still so engaging, and it floors me how he's able to do that.
Yeah, and when you say that the sort of plot is reminiscent of the Book of Job, I mean, that's 100% true, but also the language of the story is 100% reminiscent of the Book of Job. It's written in this sort of like biblical style, even though it's in this post-apocalyptic future with these AIs and everything. It's written like a Bible story. And I just love Frost as a character. And again, coming back to like, that he's like a perfect Zelazny hero to me, where he's stubborn and willful and arrogant, possibly, I guess, arrogant, but also like sincere and, cares about, he has this idealism to him and this, this sort of sincerity to him. And I think it's that combination that really works for me. And his attempts to understand what it means to be human, like you say, he like makes biological organs for himself, and then he's like trying to be an artist, and there's just really interesting a really interesting dissection of what makes something art, what makes somebody an artist. And yeah, I don't know, I just love everything about this story. I think it's super great. There's this like Rime of the Ancient Mariner-esque like construction robot who accidentally killed the last human and now goes around telling his story. It's I don't know. I love this story. I think it's so good. I was really astounded that Zelazny wrote this initially and sent it around, and it was rejected everywhere he sent it initially. And Damon Knight rejected it and said, this is kind of old hat. Could you send me something more like He Who Shapes, or The Doors of His Face, The Lamps of His Mouth? And I'm just like, oh my God, I like this so much better than those. Like, so much better. Yeah. So again, there's no accounting for taste. I guess, yeah, I mean, it does end with, so basically what happens at the end. Well, actually, let me talk first about when Frost wakes up in his human body, which again is a scene that is just burned into my memory from when I was a kid. And so he's made this massive effort to transfer his mind into this human body. And so it happens for like, it's momentarily, he's going to do it for a couple seconds or something to see how it is. And then instantly he's like, nope, that was a bad idea. It didn't work at all. Let's just forget the whole thing. Because having experienced what it's like to be a human, he's just like shaken to his core. The first thing he says is like, I fear, I think. Yeah. And then people are like, no, or the other robots, I shouldn't say people. And then the other robots are like, no, like, you were a person. I think that worked. He's like, nope, no, it didn't work. Don't put me back in there. Yeah. And it's just really, it's sort of like we say often about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that it's sort of like funny robots and stuff, but it just like gets at existential questions in this, just this way that nothing else can. So that's true of Hitchhiker's Guide, and it's true of this story to me as well. Yeah.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that moment in the story was the payoff. I mean, it's not like you're waiting through the whole story for the payoff. The whole story is delightful, but then you get to that and it's just like the fact that this immortal, all-powerful AI would choose to go into servitude to basically the devil for all eternity rather than have to live as a human being was just so funny. It's just so like, I don't know, it's gratifying too as a person, like to have somebody be like, look, your life is this hard. If there was like this all-powerful being and it had to be you for 2 seconds, it wouldn't be able to handle it. It would rather go to hell. I just thought it was as like self-aggrandizing as it is. I just thought it was really gratifying. It was really a fun moment.
Yeah, because you've seen Frost is so powerful, and then you know, like he's so powerful, but he can't take something that all of us have to deal with every day.
That's right.
There's something interesting about that. And then sort of another interesting thing that happens at the end of the story is that there's this other AI called the Beta Machine that gets transferred into a female body. And so then it's like, then the last line of the story is like, you know, they called him Frost, they called her Beta, with the clear implication that they're going to be like Adam and Eve and like repopulate the planet and stuff.
Right.
And so I wonder if this is part of why Damon Knight rejected the story, because for a long time, it was like a popular like trope in science fiction. It was called the Adam and Eve story, where at the end, it turns out that, you know, you think that's in the future or whatever, but it's actually, this is how Adam and Eve came about, is what you find out at the end. Right. So maybe in a, you know, publishing environment where that idea was so overdone, he was just kind of like, no, I don't want to publish this story. But I think it works perfectly for this story. And I think like in a completely different publishing environment where you're not seeing that idea all the time, I think it works maybe better, you know, if you're reading it today. So, but, and just the way that Zelazny writes robots too is so good. Just their choice of words and the language that they use, the sort of like, you know, the sort of biblical language coming from robots. I don't know, something about that just really works for me so well.
Yeah, I agree.
So yeah. Once again, for Breath I Tarry, totally amazing story. Everyone should read it. No notes. Okay.
Yep.
So that brings us to the end. So we've now covered every story, all 13 stories in this book. I'll just say like some of these I don't think are the best of Roger Zelazny. Some of these early ones we talked about. It's been at least 15 years since I've read any others, so I'm not in a really good position at the moment to say which ones I think they should have included instead. But some ones that I remember being awfully fond of are Devil Car, Itself Surprised, and This Moment of the Storm. So those are three that I feel like maybe ought to have made it into this book in place of some of these ones, and there may well be others. But I would really have to go back and read everything to really say for sure. But
yeah, it's such a hard decision to make, because whoever had to make it had to think there are going to be so many people out there who are going to disagree with anything. But I did feel like they could have included other ones. The only one I can think of off the top of my head that I'm, apart from the fact that it's such a hard decision to make, I would be incensed that they did not include Unicorn Variations. Because do you remember that story, Dave?
I don't honestly remember. I just know do you know the story about how it came about?
No, I'd love to.
Oh yeah. So Zelazny was hanging out with, I forget who exactly. It was like George R. Martin and Gardner Dozois, or it was something along those lines. I think they were like driving to or from a convention. And Zelazny mentioned that he had been invited to 3 different theme anthologies, like one about unicorns, one about chess, and one about stories that take place in a bar. And they said, his friends said, well, what you should do is write a story about a unicorn playing chess in a bar, and then you could tell the same story to all 3 anthologies.
I think I had read that somewhere. Yeah, that's so funny. So the story itself is, I just want to give away one line in it because it's so fantastic. Do you know the setup of the story?
No, at this point I don't remember, unfortunately.
So he's a hiker, and he's hiking across somewhere in the western U.S., and he comes across this ghost town, and there is I don't remember exactly how I'm not going to botch the details, so I'll just be quick. He comes across, it's either a griffin or a sphinx. I think it's a griffin, but my the way things should work tells me it should be a sphinx. But whichever it is, it's a mythical creature, and it's gonna eat him. And he says, "Well, why don't we play a game of chess instead? And if I win, then you let me go." And the thing's like, "Well, there's no way you're going to beat me. I'm just too good." And he's like, "Well, all right, I got nothing to lose. Then you're already going to kill me." And they're like, "Okay." So they play this game of chess, and it beats him. And then it says, "Okay, I'm going to kill you now." He's like, "Whoa, whoa, 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 just a minute." So then they end up playing for higher stakes. And I'm not sure, but I think the higher stakes are somehow it comes out that the thing is going to actually destroy the world. And it's going to do it whether he likes it or not. And he's like, "Well, we play one more game of chess this time? If I win, you spare the world." And it's like, "Okay, fine." So he makes his first move and his second move, and it becomes very clear that the thing is going to beat him. So he leaves. He's like, "Can I take a break?" And it's like, "Yeah, how long do you want?" And he's like, "I don't know, a day or two." And it's like, "Okay." So he goes hiking some more to clear his mind, and he meets a Sasquatch. And he's like, really, for whatever reason, he finds out the Sasquatch can talk. And for whatever reason, he tells it about what's going on with this chess game. And it's like, "Oh, well, what was its move?" And he's like, "You play chess?" And then it starts coaching him through the game. So he will go to the Sasquatch, tell it I'm going to say Griffin's move, and he'll go back to this bar, this like defunct like ghost town bar where he met this mythical creature, and make the move the Sasquatch said to make. And he goes back and forth for several moves. And then this is the part I love about the story. I don't care about the end of the story, anything else. Finally, the Griffin looks at him and says, "You play a lot like a Sasquatch." And that just made me fall in love with the story. But it's just a fun, like the whole easy. I heard some other writer describe it as Zelazny's easy effrontery, like his whatever enemy the main character has, they also have a friendship. It's all like frenemies in a Zelazny story, and that is so evident in that story and in most of the stories that we just discussed. And so I wish that was there. I know space would not allow this, but A Night in the Lonesome October, I read that was probably one of the last things I read by Zelazny. And it is, I don't know have you read that one?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So it's fantastic. And he wrote it sort of toward the end of his life. And Neil Gaiman was friends with him by then and spoke to him. And Zelazny said, "Hey, this novel I'm writing, I'm really happy about it. I'm letting go all the technical parts of my craft, and I'm just writing for fun. And it's coming out. I'm just enjoying it so much. And I think it's really good." And so Gaiman read it he said, "Well, can I read it when you're finished?" And he said, "Yeah, absolutely." So he let him read it. And it's a fantastic story. If you haven't read that book, I highly recommend it. It's one of Zelazny's best, in my opinion. It's very pared down, very sparse, but it's very enjoyable. And Gaiman read it and he said, Zelazny made you feel like when you read it, he made writing feel like so much fun that you just wanted to go do it immediately. And that's what I would say as a writer. Every time I read Zelazny, I'm like, I want to write. So if you're at all ever blocked, go read some Zelazny. You'll just be like energized. And then Gaiman went and wrote this story, which is one of my all-time favorite short stories, which should be included in any Best of Zelazny anthology, just as a, look, we know this isn't by Zelazny, but we think it should be in here anyway. It's called Only the End of the World Again. And it is a fantastic, absolutely wonderful story. Have you ever read that one, Dave?
I did. I remember reading it in a anthology of like end of the world stories, but I don't I remember it's sort of, I remember it's like very heavily influenced by Night in the Lonesome October, but I don't remember the details at this point.
It is, and it's got some very Zelazny moments where you think the climax of the story, you think the main character is doomed, that he's going to lose, that there's no way out of this. And then he does something that changes things, and the antagonist leaps at him, and he says, they're standing on the edge of a cliff, and the antagonist leaps at him, and he's already kind of won, but the antagonist is going to like take him down now. And he just says, I stepped 1 foot to my left, and he says, some people can't even adjust even to tiny changes. And then that's the moment when you already know when he says that the antagonist has gone off the cliff, but he doesn't have to say it. But it's this very Zelazny turn of phrase where he just puts that one sentence in there, and you're like, you feel this sense of triumph. So it is very influenced by Zelazny, but I don't mind at all. I think it's great.
Yeah, well, when you talk about, I mean, one time I heard Zelazny's, I think he said, if I'm remembering correctly, that his goal was to write prose that was breezy yet poetic. Yeah. And I've always thought that was both a perfect description of Zelazny's writing and a perfect description of the kind of prose that, a writer should be aiming for, that it's like easy to read, fast paced, but beautiful. And, and that's just what I love about his books that I love. They have that sort of breezy yet poetic style, which is why some of the stuff, we've talked about earlier, it's not breezy enough for me. It's too much on the scale balanced toward poetic and not enough toward breezy. But to my mind, he's at his best when he balances the breezy and poetic. I just wanted to actually read a couple lines I wrote down, because I think he's such a intellectual, wise kind of thinker, and so you just get some of these lines I really like. So just a couple I wanted to mention. The burden of proof is on the moralist. You must reconcile yourself to the fact that something is always hurt by any change. Even the most heartening of philosophical vistas is no match for, say, a toothache, if it happens to be your own. And nobody wants to be completely ignored, to be an object for whom no one has really strong feelings. Hatred and love are the ultimate forms of human regard. So, yeah.
I remember the stories all those came from. I mean, that last one's from He Who Shapes. And those are all fantastic lines. And yeah, I agree. I mean, his it's funny you mentioned that. It's almost like he maybe had like knobs, like here's the breezy knob and I can turn that up to a certain degree, and here's the poetic knob and I can turn that up to a certain degree, and maybe he had him up to poetic up too high and the breezy not up high enough for certain stories. I think you're probably right about that. I think that's a really good insight. I also, there was something else you made me think of though when you were saying that, the breezy and poetic. I have always assumed, and I read this in an intro he wrote to one of his stories in one anthology or another. I had several of his anthologies when I was younger, but I just always have this picture in my mind that he was a huge fan of poetry, that he read a lot of poetry.
Oh, for sure.
And I don't know. Okay, good. So, and that comes across when you read his stuff. And I remember almost every one of our science fiction teachers at Clarion saying, you must read more than just science fiction. It was a great Tim Powers quote where he's like, which I think he was quoting someone else, but he said, some people, you read their work and you get the idea they've never read anything outside of science fiction, if that. But I think, what a great genre it would be. Not that it isn't a great genre, but how much better it would be if everybody read a lot of poetry. Now, when I read Zelazny, I can feel the poetry in his words, and it makes me think I should read more poetry. And then I read poetry and I think, I don't really want to read poetry. I want to go read more Zelazny. So I think, I don't know, he just does this great job of like reading the poetry for us and then, putting it into science fiction in such a unique way that is, very breezy and very poetic.
No, I mean, there's no question that he has this like encyclopedic knowledge of like the Western canon of poetry and, mythology and, literature and everything. I mean, there was this, like I said, I wasn't crazy about the LOKI, 7281, whatever it was story, but I did think this line was kind of funny. He says, this is the word processor talking. It says, and it's talking about Zelazny. He's begun writing a new novel. Predictably, it involves an immortal and an obscure mythology. Geez. And reviewers say he's original. He hasn't had an original thought for as long as I've known him. So,
It's almost like a critique of Amber, right?
Well, it's like this funny self-deprecating thing, but I mean, I think it's, it's not true. I mean,
No.
he was always like experimenting and trying new things, like, whether it's, people give all sorts of examples, but like, even like, in Doorways in the Sand, how each chapter starts out, or each chapter ends on a cliffhanger, and then the next chapter picks up some distance away from that cliffhanger and then fills in how we got from the cliffhanger to here. And every chapter is like that. I mean, he was
that infuriates a lot of people. I've read people online just saying like, I would like this book, but it's written so stupid. They get all angry about it.
Yeah. But he was always, like because that's the thing. I mean, I think that's why you read Zelazny and it makes you want to be a writer, is because you can just feel how much fun he's having doing it. And, and you just want to have that kind of fun yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
So, all right, this has gone pretty long, so we should start wrapping this up. But this is super fun talking about Zelazny, one of my favorite topics. So maybe we can come back sometime and talk about, Night in the Lonesome October, or Doorways in the Sand, or
I'd love to.
Something like that. Was it Road? I've never read. Is it Road
Oh,
Marks?
I was going to mention Road Marks in this podcast because I read it when I was I started looking up, for whatever reason, I started looking up different stuff of his when I was reading through this anthology, and came across a cover image of Road Marks online, and it hit me. I was like, I owned that. I know I owned that because it's this cool picture of this old like 1940s pickup truck, with the rounded fenders and the rounded top, and it's driving down the middle of this Route 66-ish desert road with this like dragon flying above it. And I vividly remember owning that, holding that in my hands. And I don't remember anything about the book, except I came across, when I was on Amazon, I saw that image. I also looked at the reader reviews. And it was like, the vast majority of people were like 5 stars, best book ever. I reread this over and over and over again. And the vast minority were like, this is one of his worst. Don't even pick this up. And so what that says to me is, it's very heavy on the rereadable, aesthetic, easy in your own skin feeling, and probably very light on plot and story. So I'm thinking you might not like it, Dave, but I probably will. I'm like, okay, I got to get a copy of this now. I saw it. And I was like, I'm going to love this. It's probably very similar to Doorways in the Sand, or probably just at least very rereadable.
Yeah, I don't know if I would like it or not. Like I said, like a lot of his novels are kind of hit or miss with me, but I just saw, George R. Martin has been trying to turn it into a TV show, so I thought cool. It might be worth reading it now in case that ever happens. I'll be ready.
Yeah.
But yeah, so let's definitely come back and talk about Zelazny again sometime. But I think for now, I guess, Tom, any other final thoughts before we wrap things up?
One just popped into my head. It's a tangent, but he apparently Tom Cruise was originally going to be in a right after Risky Business and Top Gun. He was going to be in a movie called Doorways in the Sand, and then I think he went and did Cocktail instead or something like that. But yeah, he was going to do Doorways in the Sand, and then he jumped ship on it. And then I feel like Doorways in the Sand got turned into Men in Black at some point. I know it started out with the comic, but I feel like the comic was heavily inspired by Doorways in the Sand, and heavily inspired the movie as well. So it would have been really cool to see a young Tom Cruise playing Fred Cassidy in Doorways in the Sand. I'd love to talk about that if it ever happens, if they ever make that into a movie. Not with Tom Cruise now, he's too old, but anyway. Yeah,
that was something that came up in my interview with Warren Lapine. He was talking about that. So again, if you...
that's where I saw it. That was from you again. Sorry.
But anyway, if you're listening to this and you just can't wait for more Zelazny conversations, definitely check out my interview with Warren Lapine and my interview with F. Brett Cox, because there's all sorts of great Zelazny content there.
Yeah.
But we're going to have to... And yeah, that would have been amazing if Tom Cruise had starred in Doorways in the Sand and it had made Zelazny, super famous to a mainstream audience and stuff.
Yeah.
I'm still holding out hope that, because George R. Martin, because Robert Kirkman, who did the comic that The Walking Dead is based on, and Stephen Colbert have been trying to get an Amber TV show going. So I'm still holding out hope that that'll happen and make Zelazny a household name. So.
Yeah, let's
fingers
hope.
crossed there. But yeah, so let's wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Tom Gerencer, and again, this new book, it's called The Best of Roger Zelazny. So Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it was super fun. Thank you.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Tom Gerencer for joining us on the show. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.